Okay, good morning. Thanks. Thanks for showing up, even if after yesterday's boring lecture. Do you have any questions before we start about yesterday's, or all good? Yeah. Thanks. So yeah, today we're gonna have a little bit more, inside knowledge into actual ecological stuff. Yesterday it was mostly like a brief intro to networks, so we all understand each other when I say, node, link, vulnerability, mid-food chain length, and all that stuff. But today, yeah, we are going to be talking about, more specific ecological concepts. The kind of things that ecologists. I don't know how many of you did ecology for their degrees or the masters, but this is kind of the things that I teach my ecology students when I teach ecology. So. And this particular lecture is about how we can study the distribution of species across space. So, which sometimes called spatial ecology. In particular, I am interested in how networks of species interactions assemble across spatial scales. And this all sort of started back in the late 1800s when it was, I guess, kind of fashionable for natural historians, which were, the people who used to do ecology before ecologists. They liked traveling around the world and looking at what animals and plants they could see in different places. And one of the things that they liked to do was to sort of document which species they saw where, and in specific settings, like, for example, islands. So Darwin did this in where? Where? Galapagos. Wallace did this here in the southeast of Asia. And ever since Wallace and all of these other guys started doing this for example, in the Indonesian archipelago, they realized that there were some patterns in the distribution of species amongst these islands. In this particular case, one thing that Wallace realized is that the communities that are found in islands to the right of this line, so from Borneo, Java, Thailand, and so on, were like very different in terms of how they look like and their evolutionary histories than the ones to the other side of this line. So in islands like Papua New Guinea, Philippines, and all that. And this, this was really surprising to him because these islands being so close to one another, they sort of thought that they were they should have the same sort of evolutionary background history. And because of that, he sort of proposed, or this biogeographical region was split into two parts based on this line here, which now we call Wallace's line, named after him, and all of this is Wallacea. So basically, they started observing patterns like this, and people started quantifying these patterns in systematic ways. And one of the things that they sort of came up with, or one of the recurrent patterns that was observed, is something that we now call the species-area relationship. Have you ever heard of this? Some of you have, some of you haven't. Cool. So the species-area relationship is just a plot in which on the x-axis you have area, so the size of the land or marine or aquatic area you are sampling. Like, for example, if you are sampling islands, it would be the square kilometer of the size, the land size of each of the islands. And on the y-axis, you have the number of species, like for example, in this example here. And it turns out that, by doing this across different systems, starting with, for example, the seminal paper by Preston in 62, which you're welcome to read here, this thing has like a very predictable sort of shape. And can you guess what would be the shape of this? We encountered this yesterday in the degree distribution. It is a power law, right? Remember that yesterday when we were talking about the degree distributions, I told you that it's not only in networks that you observe this behavior, but like in the distribution of earthquakes, the sizes of cities and things like that. Well, it turns out that also in the distribution of the number of species in areas, it's one of the universal patterns in ecology. And this is perhaps the first true law in ecology. Some people have thought of this in this way. And the reason why this is because it's like it's like an universal pattern. It has been seen, like as I said, in many different systems across many different taxonomic groups. It sort of provides a quantitative way for us to try to analyze why ecological systems behave the way they do. So starting from this basis, we now have like something, a pattern, a natural pattern that we want or that we can try to better understand and approximate, right? So in order to do this, people, since back in the days, they started, well, with the basic thing, which is, writing down the equation for the species area relationship. This just comes from, fitting a line to this pattern. And in that way, you have the traditional or the classical expression for the species area relationship, in which you can predict using some exponent that you can quantify. You are able to predict how many species you get in an area given its size. And as you can see, this is like a very interesting thing, because by doing that, you can start answering questions that are also of a more applied nature, like for example, what would happen with habitat loss, right? Because habitat loss is basically a reduction in area of different habitats. So there are like interesting implications of these kind of things, not only understanding how the system itself behaves, but also like how we can use this knowledge to better create, in this case, conservation measures. So it's one of the nice things for used in ecological conservations as well. So one thing that you can do with this equation, as I mentioned there, is to apply logarithm to both cases, and in that way you linearize that, and it's easy to find the set exponent for that. And it turns out that across many different systems, as I said, and across many different taxonomic groups, this is like a sort of universal thing. But the thing is that this set here, the exponent, is kind of controversial. What is the actual true value of it across all of the systems? It is something that ranges between 0.1 and 0.5, and usually it's around 0.25. But as I said, there is like a very big debate in ecology as to what is truly, the true value of that relationship. And if you're interested in that, you can go to this paper here, which provides some interesting discussions as to why there might be some divergence across systems and ecosystems for the actual value of this number. So this was sort of the first kind of attempts to not really explain, but mostly describe these kind of patterns. But then, as as the field of ecology progressed, people started to like wondering more about what are the mechanisms behind this, right? And it was in 1967, I think, that, sorry, yeah, that these two guys, you probably already heard about them from Pablo's classes. Robert Mcarthur, the guy in the bottom, and Edward Wilson. So Robert Mcarthur is considered one of the founding fathers of modern ecology, like mostly because he started one of the first ones to apply like quantitative tools to actually understand natural history of ecosystems. Well, this is one of his contributions, but his main contribution is about the niche partitioning. So his doctoral thesis was about how warblers in the UK partition the heights of trees to forage in different levels. And he was a student of also one of the prominent ecologists, George Hutchinson. So yeah, he started like not only working on these things, but he was working in many different areas. So it's really interesting. One of my favorite books is his book called Geographical Ecology. If you are interested in any of these things, I would highly recommend that book. So anyway, just a little divergence. So yeah, I was saying that, it's nice to have the SARS, it's nice to have this equation. Now we know how the system behaves, but as Levin said, understanding patterns in terms of the processes that produce them is, the actual essence of science, right? And it's key to the development of fundamental principles, but also to develop management actions and strategies. So the whole thing, and it's also kind of I think should be the right approach to science, is to try to create this theory and models that allow us to understand mechanistically these patterns. And this is what these two guys tried to do with the distribution of species across areas. They wanted to know why, or propose a theory as to what might be the mechanisms for that, right? So when they were looking at this data and imagining what would be, the reasons why this might happen, they imagined that they had an archipelago of islands that were away from some mainland in which there were some number of species, and they had like islands of different sizes, and not only of different sizes, but that they were at different distances from this mainland, right? And then by doing that, they sort of realized, or they proposed that the size of these areas would be a determinant of what they called the extinction rate of species. So if you live in a very small island, first of all, you need to compete harder to get resources, and second of all, there would be like a less number of habitats in which you can live, right? So you can, it's sort of easy or intuitive to see how small islands will probably have less species, because it will be more likely for them to go extinct, and also to, being less able to gather resources. The other way around, larger islands are expected to have like smaller extinction rates. But the other sort of key thing is the distance from the mainland, right? So if you rely on a colonization pool of species, then obviously the closer you are to that, the largest is your probability or rate of getting colonized by a new species. So there is a trade-off between how close you are and how big you are. And very far and small islands are expected to have very low number of species, whereas very close and large islands are expected to have a lot of species. And by thinking in that way, they came up with a a graphical framework to derive this equation here. So the graphical framework is just basically the fact that if you imagine that you have decolonization and or extinction rates on here, and this is the number of species, then for islands that are close, as the colonization rate increases, obviously the number of species increases, and as the colonization rate decreases, the number of species decreases also. And for the extinction rate is the other way around, right? And then for close islands, you will have a higher sort of probability of getting colonized, and for smaller islands, you will have a smaller one. And then for small islands, you will have a higher colonization, extinction rate, and for larger islands, you will have a smaller one. And then the intersection of these lines, here and here, is what that equation is it's telling you, basically. That the number of species, it's a trade-off or an equilibrium between colonization and extinction. So, yeah, that is all nice. And yeah, with this framework now, they have like a very interesting way of predicting, you know, and not only in islands like in an ocean landscape, but also, you know, like mountain tops or forest fragments or anything in which the movement of individuals between those things is highly unlikely, and they rely on colonization from like a big area, right? So again, in this case, you can see how a framework like this can be used for like predicting the number of species that you have if you set up like a protected area of some size, or depending on how far it is from the original pool of species and all that. So now you have two variables that you can quantify and that you can use to make predictions about your, in this case, for example, protected areas, right? How far it is from somewhere and how big it is. That is why it's so important in conservation ecology that it's not only a matter of where are the areas that you want to protect placed, but how big they are. Because if they are not big enough, then regardless of what are the species that are there now, they are doomed to extinction anyway, right? Because they won't be able to sustain viable populations or being recolonized by anyone else. So they even if you conserve for a short period of time, they still will get extinct at some point. And these kind of frameworks, like, you know, help you understand and, you know, make predictions about this. Cool. So, do you have any questions about the theory of island biogeography? By the way, this whole thing, even though I sort of skimmed through it in like 10 minutes or whatever, it's like a whole book that these two guys wrote. So if you are interested in, you know, like the whole mathematical formulation and how they derived the whole analysis, everything it's in there. So nice. Cool. So the next thing is the other way of thinking about this, the spatial distribution of these species is not only in terms of how many species you will find somewhere, but also in terms of where in your landscape, if you have a spatially explicit landscape, where will you be able, or in which fraction of your landscape will you actually be able to find some species of interest, right? And thinking in this way, back in, when was this? Back in 1960. Yeah, 1969. Richard Levins was looking at a system in which he was trying to predict the fraction of patches of a given crop, because this was like an applied problem for pest management. The fraction of patches of a given crop that a pest could invade, right? That could occupy. And this is very relevant because, well, there is like a lot of research into pest management and what are the best strategies to, you know, to prevent pests from invading crops and so on. And he came up with, you know, this very nice little equation that ended up being like the foundational model for metapopulation dynamics. And I guess that at that point, the whole concept of metapopulation, you know, started taking off. And basically what this model suggests is that, again, here we see that the interesting thing is the trade-off or the interplay between colonization and extinction. In this case, instead of trying to predict the number of species that you will find somewhere, what you are trying to do here is to try to predict the fraction of some given patches that you have available based on their colonization and extinction rates. If you, I mean, once you have a little nice equation like this, as you might already know, then one thing that is very easy to calculate is what is the expected fraction that you will get, in this case, the fraction of patches occupied, that you will get from, if you know your extinction and colonization rates, right? So if you know, for example, a lot of the biology of your species, you will be able to know how many patches of your crop to expect to be colonized. Or if you are in a more sort of conservation type of scenario, you should be able to know if you can quantify, you know, colonization and extinction, you should be able to know how much of your landscape your target species should be able to live in, right? So this is very interesting. So yeah, if you do that, then you have that. So you can then, using this very simple expression, quantify that, right? One of the things that I wanted to do through the lectures was, as I mentioned yesterday, is not only to explain these ecological concepts, but also to introduce a little bit of how we study them, like in the computer, not only using like mathematical approaches. So here I wanted to, you know, provide a little example of just as a toy model for, in case you're interested in developing further ODE models, to see how to actually implement this in R. And you can find that here. So basically, this is the simulation. Yep.
In this model, we think only about extinction and colonization, or we can think about immigration and immigration as well?
Not yet, but we are coming to that in the next model.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, because in this model, it's not entirely spatial explicit. So you don't really have explicitly defined the links, the dispersal links between local communities, local populations. You only have the sort of an implicit representation of the fraction of patches that you have. Yeah. But yeah, you are right. The next sort of level of complexity in these type of models is that you look at the actual spatially explicit structure of the population, and then you have of the metapopulation, and then you have different ways of connecting these patches, and the interplay between the structure of this network of patches and the dispersal between them will determine the final outcome of, of metapopulation, persistence, and occupancy as well. So, yeah, we will talk a little bit about that in a minute. Did you have a question as well? Yeah.
Thinking about like pests and crops, shouldn't like the extinction rate like be really small or basically zero? Because they're like, I imagine they're like an invasive species.
Yeah.
So how does this work here if E is 0?
Well, if it's 0, obviously, all of the patches are expected to be occupied. So the whole point of knowing this is that you should you should kill the pest in a given number of patches, such as the average extinction rate is some number that makes this a good enough number. It will never be 0, right? Because if you wanted it to be 0, then you have to kill it everywhere. But you can, if you are happy with your pest being in, 30% of your patches, then the way in which I would use this would be to try to kill it in certain number of patches as to reduce or bring up the extinction rate to some number, and then see and then use a framework like this to calculate the final expected number of patches in which it will be found, if you see what I mean. I mean, obviously, it's also because it depends on the ratio of these things, right? So the colonization, it will also, how many patches you should be eradicate the pest on will also depend on how easy it can colonize other habitats, right? So if colonization, if you're lucky and colonization is low, then you won't have to use as much pesticide. But if colonization is really high, then you will probably have to manage a lot of the patches. So, yeah. And actually, that's an interesting thing because it's something that you can actually try with this code that I gave you here. So this is basically the implementation of this equation in an ODE solver that you can use to run numerical simulations for this model, and and see what happens, basically, explore different scenarios. So in this particular example, I used a value of C of 0.15 and a value of E of 0.05. And if you use this equation to calculate P based on E and C, which are those two numbers, then you should get the value at which this plot is approaching equilibrium. So you should get this, right? I'm guessing that this should be very easy for all of you, right? Or if not, please let me know. I am just assuming that all of you are very mathematically inclined, so. But if anyone is not, just please ask me, yeah. Cool, yeah.
I have a question about the model.
Yeah.
Because, we can interpret it like C times P minus C times P squared. And this means that the number of patches decrease if there is like an intrinsic competition between the patches, or how can I interpret that P squared?
So you are thinking if you do this?
Yes.
So you want to know what is this?
Yes. Or how can I interpret this? Like this is a decreasing of the patches?
Yeah, that's a good question. Let me think about this. So if you have Yeah, I guess that you need to, so when you're calculating how many will get sort of colonized, you need to remove from that calculation the ones that are already colonized. So you cannot count the ones that are colonized as being colonized again, because you are basically counting the ones that can be colonized anew. Okay. So from the entire colonization term, which is this, you need to remove the ones that cannot like colonize themselves if they are already colonized.
Okay.
So,
okay. Yeah. Thank you.
I did it. Yeah. So this part is the sort of colonization term. So this is what tells you how many sort of new are going to get. So from that, you need to remove the ones that already are colonized, because you cannot like count them twice, let's say, you know? Yeah. Is that clear or? I guess it's easier to see here, because basically what you are saying is that you are going to apply this rate only to, you know, the ones that are still left. So 1 minus p, basically. So, yeah. Cool. Any more questions? This is nice. Come on. Please ask me more things. Yeah.
Hi. I understood, but why do we have to multiply C times P and then multiply by 1 minus P? Why is it not just C times 1 minus P?
Because the colonization rate depends on, you know, the ones that are occupied times the ones that are not occupied. So the ones that are occupied will like be able to give things to the other one, right? So, yeah.
Yes, thank you.
What's that, sorry? Ah, okay, cool. Nice. So yeah, you can use this code here and try like different values and see what happens. And using approaches like this, you know, for simulating the dynamics, then you can start doing some more like nicer plots like this, right? In which, and ecologists really like these kind of things. So with this kind of plots, you can look at what are the different C versus E values that give you persistence and to what extent. So, for example, anything above this line will go extinct, and anything below this line will start becoming more and more successful across the landscape. And again, this information is kind of interesting if you want to know, you know, for a species, if you know their colonization capacities and the likelihood of extinction, what sort of fraction of the landscape you should expect it to be at. So, cool. So, yeah. Now we get into the interesting part that, sorry, what was your name? What is it? Tawe. Tawein. Tao. Okay. So yeah, what Tao was getting at before, which is what happens when we are interested in a more explicit representation of space, right? And basically it boils down to the fact that or to try to deal with with some of the assumptions of the previous model, which are that all of the patches have the same local conditions, they are all connected in the same way, dispersal between the patches are the same kind of thing. So that those assumptions, if we want to, if we are not happy with them, then we need like more sophisticated models that can incorporate that information. And by doing that, one of the sort of most interesting results in metapopulation biology is the fact that when you have heterogeneity across your patches and you think about your patches in this way, that they are connected in different ways, local conditions are different for the species at different locations, then you can get phenomena like, for example, source sink dynamics, in which a population might survive at the regional level because good patches can give in the surplus of individuals to bad patches. But if you were to look at only a bad patch at a local scale, you would think that that population would collapse, right? So this is why people started looking into metapopulations, because sometimes they realized that they didn't really understand why a species that had a negative growth rate would still be able to survive in some area. And the reason is this, because of source sink dynamics across the metapopulation. And ever since then, people have been using models to represent landscapes, like, for example, this is an example from a metapopulation of butterflies in Finland by a famous ecologist called Ilkka Hanski, who studied metapopulations heavily, like for a long time. And he developed some sort of models that, allow you to make these predictions. In here, however, I'm going to not really talk much about the spatially explicit metapopulations, but go another level of complexity up, which is spatially explicit meta-communities. And in meta-communities, you can think of the model that you were interested in as a meta-community, but only with one species. So, most of the things we're going to be talking about are still valid for that. But here I am mostly interested in the networks of species interactions, right? So I'm going to go a little bit quick over single populations, meta-populations into meta-communities. So after a bit, after people were thinking a little bit about metapopulations and the implications of space, the key thing here is the spatial processes, right? Spatial processes that can give you new information that that with looking only at a local population you wouldn't have access to, and because of that, ecologists realized that the final outcome of biodiversity, which is what we want to study, biogeography, where and when the species are. It's an interplay between spatial dynamics and the local processes that are happening in local patches, right? So species interactions, habitat filtering, all of that thing that happens at a local scale interacts in some ways with spatial dynamics to provide the picture of biodiversity. And by realizing that, and the fact that local patches are usually not composed of a single population, well, usually not all the time, then people started thinking about what we now call meta-communities. And in meta-communities, basically, what we have is a way of thinking about these processes that I have been describing in words. So there are at least 4 different paradigms in meta-community theory to think about what would be the expected outcome of a trade-off between species interactions, in the simplest case, competition between 2 species, and their dispersal capacities across patches in a landscape, right? So the first sort of way of thinking about this is the first paradigm in meta-community theory, which is called patch dynamics. And in patch dynamics, well, before getting into the actual explanation, so in these pictures that I'm going to be drawing, the little symbols inside the big ones represent the species. So in this case, this little square is a species that is called A. And in this case, this little oval is another species that I call B. And the big symbols are their habitats. So, and the arrows between the different patches are the dispersal corridors between the patches of the species occupying that patch, right? So in the first kind of meta-community paradigm here, that is called patch dynamics. Basically, you are assuming that the species, again, this is all what you need to think about this framework in terms of a trade-off between your abilities to survive locally, which in the simplest case here is competition. So how good you are at outcompeting your enemy, let's say, and how good you are at moving across the landscape. So in a patch dynamic situation, you sort of assume that species are very good at competing in their habitat, but they are not very good at moving. So the strategy they adopted in this trade-off was to be very good at their own thing, but being less good at moving around. And in this particular example, the strength of the arrow here means that this species might be good at moving from this patch to this patch, but since it's not adapted to this kind of patch, it cannot survive there. So even if it could move there, it wouldn't be able to survive. Whereas the other species who could be able to live in this patch because it matches its shape, which means that it's adapted to that patch, it's never able to colonize it because it adopted the strategy of being very good locally, but being very bad at moving away. So that's one way of thinking about this. Then the second way that we have of thinking about this, we have basically this same situation, and here we have the other species which was able to colonize, and they can move everywhere, but with a very sort of weak movement. And this paradigm is called species sorting. And again, here, basically the strategy of both of the species was to be very good locally, but very bad at moving elsewhere. Which means that if you have these situations, then it would be very easy for you to predict local biodiversity because you just need to look at what's the habitat. And then you will know which species are there, right? The challenging thing would be to know why a species is somewhere where the habitat is supposed not to be good for that species. And the reason for that is dispersal. Then, thinking about that dispersal thing, the next sort of paradigm is when you make these lines very strong. So when you make these lines very strong, you assume that the species are good at moving. So basically, in this situation, all the species can be anywhere because they will be very good at the patch that they are adapted to, but they will also be good at the patch that, at moving away, which means that they will be able to send individuals to other places. And in that situation, you will find this, that in all of the patches, you find all of the species, right? Yep.
But in the rules that we set, squares should be like inside squares and
yep.
Circles inside.
Well, this is just to mean that this is the habitat that they are adapted to. But when you have like a strong dispersal situation, then a species that is very successful here, for example, bee, can send like the surplus of individuals because it's a very good disperser, and they can survive here. If you were to cut this arrow, then this species will die out because it doesn't have, I mean, it's not maintaining a self-sustaining population locally. You only see it because the individuals that are good at moving, they went there and just passed by. But it wouldn't be able to survive in that patch if it wasn't for the influx of individuals. Yeah. But yeah, you are right. The species, the shape of the species, when it matches the habitat, it's because it means in this illustration that it's adapted to that habitat. Yeah. And then the last thing is basically like a sort of new. Oh, sorry.
Is there any reason for in figure the D one, yes, this one, the B is a little bit outside of the square, or no reason, just something?
No, I think
it was. And the arrows, the two arrows, the C one and the D ones, they are different because one is a little bigger than the other one, thicker.
In which one, sorry?
C and D.
No, I think the arrows are supposed to be the same. Yeah. If they are not, it's either a mistake or not really relevant. But
okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. No. So the difference why you have two arrows here and only one here is just because in this case, in the neutral case, you are assuming that everybody disperses in the same way, whereas here you have a specific dispersal of A and a specific dispersal of B. But the fact that the square is a bit shifted outside, it's not.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, no, in the neutral case, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the neutral theory of ecology. Basically, what it assumes is that, and this is an extension of that theory to meta-communities, which basically says that all of the species behave in the same way, right? So they have the exact same competitive abilities and the exact same dispersal abilities across the entire landscape. Yeah. So obviously, natural community. Do you guys have any more questions about any of these four things? No? Cool. So this is just to mean that only because we have this, it doesn't mean that natural systems behave in this way. This is just like a cartoonish representation to understand what might be the processes that actually happen. And I guess it is our job as ecologists to actually find, within the continuum of all these possibilities, what is the one that actually really, first of all, reproduce the patterns in observed systems, and also that we can use to predict the future behavior, right? So it's not that, I'm not trying to say that systems behave in either of these ways. This is just like a continuum of possibilities in which most natural systems, not to say all, are probably found in between any of these things. And it will be like a complex mixture depending on the different species that you have, right? Because some species might be good at some things, some species at some other things. So, but this actually helps us to start thinking about, our next question, which is how we can use this kind of thinking to, the main sort of, the main focus that I wanted to bring up in this lecture, which is what is how can we use these frameworks and these models to understand the scaling of biodiversity, and in particular to move one level above the species-area relationship to what we have called the network-area relationship. So we are no longer, we are still interested in the species-area relationship, but now we want to see what happens also to another aspect of biodiversity, which is the species interaction networks. Basically, what I have done here is I have given you a couple of examples of the two paradigms that we have spoken about today. So the theory of island biogeography and the meta-community theory, to explore how we can use a model like that to try to predict the outcome of the scaling of different network properties. You remember of those properties that we looked at yesterday, and I don't know if some of you were already sleeping by then, but all of those things, we are interested in knowing how they change, how they scale with area. And this is a series of theoretical models that we developed to do that. So what I'm going to do now is to try to go into the full details of the models via the code, and then we are going to look at the outcome of these things, right? But yeah, just feel free to like play around with the code and see what we come up with. So in the first model, which is basically an extension of the theory of island biogeography, the idea is that we are going to have the same situation we had before for the island biogeography theory, in which we have a pool, and then we imagine that we have like a bunch of islands, and there is like a trade-off between extinction and colonization. And then what we are going to do is to add to this model the further constraint that a species is only able to colonize if there is a prey. So if you cannot have a resource in that island, you cannot colonize it because you wouldn't be able to survive, right? So in here, instead of imagining like only one species, you need to imagine that you have like a network of, the kind of networks that we were talking about yesterday. And then what we do is we draw from the theory of island biogeography based on the trade-off between extinction and colonization, which in this code is so colonization is kept constant at 0.7, because what we are interested in is the trade-off, so the ratio between these two things, and we vary extinction. So by doing that, then we have this for loop here. The first one, it sort of goes over different EC ratios. And that EC ratio, as we saw using the equation for the theory of island biogeography, will allow us to quantify or to calculate the number of species that we expect to see in each of these islands. And then what we do is we generate networks of a given known structure, a food web structure. And we take from that network that number of species given by the theory of island biogeography at random, with the constraint that I mentioned before, that any species that we take at random has to be connected. So for example, if we take, what this means is that in the pool, we no longer have only a species, but a pool of species, but we actually have an entire network, which we will call MetaWeb. And this network, which might be connected in whatever way we want, following a food web structure. And this network has a given number of species. I think in this case it was 60. So we draw the number of species that we would expect from the theory of island biogeography, and then from this MetaWeb, regional web, we choose this number of species randomly, and then we remove the ones that do not have a prey. And by doing that, we start building, based on different colonization extinction ratios, remember that that ratio gives you the size of your community, then we have different patch sizes, right? Did you all get that? Are you sure? No? Cool. So let me start again. Maybe I should start by explaining the model. Well, maybe not. Let's not complicate things. So let's say that I have, in a given, let's try to do this with an example. In a given ecosystem, or in a given country, in a given continent, I know the entire food web. I know the entire network of species interactions, right? And this network is the network that I was drawing before. So you have this network, and we are going to call this network a meta web, right? Meta web, sort of meaning that the regional web of all the possible species. And then this would be like the representation of your entire ecosystem, right? So this is how your ecosystem look at the regional scale. Everything that you need to know about that system is here, at least in terms of species interaction. So then the other information you have from the theory of island biogeography is that if this is your mainland, let's say your pool, if you want to predict how this network would look like in an island that is of some size, then you can calculate that by using the equation from the theory of island biogeography, and that would give you a number Sn, the number of species in that island. That island is of the size of the ratio between extinction and colonization. So far, so good? Yep. I haven't introduced anything new. I have only said networks, which is what we saw yesterday. So this would be the representation of an ecosystem. And I have now a way of calculating Sn using the first equation we saw today. All good? Yep. So we know how many species we are expected to have in an area or an island of a given size. So once I do this, I assume that I can choose that number of species randomly from here. So let's say that Sn is equal to, 5, right? So I just choose 5 nodes from here randomly. Let's say that I chose this, and let's say this. And in that way, we have in some area that is given by the ratio, we have this network, which is this. Cool. So this is the random network that came from choosing 5 nodes randomly here. In this scenario, we don't have any disconnected nodes, so we keep it as it is. But if we would have chosen, for example, this one instead of this, then this node would have been disconnected and our network would only have had 4 species. Yep.
But you can take randomly the species, but you should not take like the basal species, like the plants and the top predators, like, because you need to have plants in they colonize the island to have the food strain. So
yeah, no, you could keep adding constraints. So this would be like the most sort of null expectation from this approach. But then you can, as in any other model, you can keep incorporating like further constraints, right? So we did that actually. And I think that in this code, let's see. No, in this code, we didn't do that. But yeah, you can, depending on, the question that you are trying to answer or exactly, how you think biologically that your model should be specified, then you can start adding those constraints. But in this particular case, we just wanted to see what would happen if species are chosen randomly. Yeah, yeah.
If the pool is a network more modular, it will influence the SN or more nested?
No, SN is independent of the structure of the network because it's just a number that we quantify, that we calculate using the first equation in you know, the S equals this equation. So with those two numbers that we have C and E, which are this and this, and we have the SP, which is the total number of species in the network. So S at a given patch, it's independent of the network structure. So we just draw for a given colonization extinction ratio the number of species that we should expect in that size of island, and get randomly this number of nodes from there. Yeah. Yes.
In that link that you put on with the 5 species there,
yep,
there is a link that is indirect link, or some, because you have these 4 species there that are the 4, these up, yes, and then you have the bottom one, and the bottom one is directly linked to one of them but not to the second.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Oh, okay, because I thought that you were considering indirect links, but you don't have these species in the other islands.
No, this is very,
okay.
There is nothing hidden here. This is very simple, easy.
Okay.
It should work as it's on the paper.
Thank you.
Sorry, it was a mistake on the, yeah.
In the, you guys in the article, you simulated this thing.
Yeah.
One of the things that the theory of island biogeography predicts that you have a turnover of species, right, in the island throughout the time.
Across islands. No, not really through time, because that just assumes that you have a number of species at equilibrium. So you can calculate S for a given CE, and that's the number of species that you should expect to have, like.
But the composition will change over time, because you have extinctions and colonizations going through time.
Well, the theory of island biogeography doesn't say anything about composition. It's just about the number of species in that. That's why, you know, we started talking about all of the other stuff, because there have been developments since then that, you know, worked towards understanding better not only species richness but also composition. And this is one example of that, because in here we do have time and things get colonized in, I think we did 100 time steps or something, but it's like an iterative process, because then things can appear and disappear based on the constraints of the food web.
Because I was imagining, like, when you have a long time, and eventually the number of species in the island will get saturated. But it gets saturated not because colonization and extinction have stopped, but because they are balancing each other out. Right?
Balancing each other. What do you mean exactly by balancing each
because,
other?
This is a dynamical equilibrium. The extinction is still happening, colonization is still happening, but the number of species attain the equilibrium because these two things are balancing each other out, the colonization and extinction, through time.
Yeah.
And if those things are happening, the number of species will remain stable, but the species in the island can change through time.
Yeah.
Because you have, and in this case, you are considering like the composition, because each species has a position in the trophic web and everything. So it could be possible, for example, I don't know, it's a question, that in a given moment of the simulation, you happen to have an extinction of a crucial node and the whole thing just collapses?
Yeah, that is possible, yeah.
Did you find this in the simulations?
To be honest, we were not like looking at that specifically, so I don't really have an answer for that because I didn't look at that. I just ran the model and then looked at the scaling patterns. But yeah, it is a possibility because, as you say here, which is different from the original theory of island biogeography, we had actual species and we could quantify the composition. So the rates were applied to each species like independently. So by chance, one species could go extinct and what you said happened. So yeah, I don't know, how many times that happened, but I mean, all the code is there. So if you're interested in these things, I guess it would make a nice project, yeah. Cool. So after repeating this process like a lot of times and applying the extinction and colonization rates to the different species that were in the island and those that weren't, then at the end we end up with something that looks like this, right? And just by looking at the fact that they, that this sort of saturates and achieves some sort of equilibrium, you can already tell that you have, like a mechanistic explanation for why a sort of scaling relationship with, for example, the number of interactions would be possible to obtain if you knew, in this case, colonization extinction ratios, which is a proxy for area size. And then, yeah, earlier this year, we tried to look at how this looks like in empirical data, and yeah, we found some interesting relationships or commonalities between this. So this is just an example of how you could use a meta-community, a theory of island biogeography model to understand these things. So the next thing we did. Do you have any questions about this model or anything that, all good? Yep, perfect. Yeah, as I said, you can just, if you rerun this code, you should get a plot like this. And the other thing that you can do, if you are interested in looking at, for example, how other properties change here, I have included in the code all the properties that we looked at the other day. So not only the number of links, but the diet breadth, so generality, vulnerability, the fraction of the different kind of species across the food web, and yeah. So you can also look at other properties of interest, like for example, how the relationship between specialist and generalist species changes through area, through space. Cool. So to actually be able to compare or to try to say more things or find more mechanisms for these kind of relationships, we moved on from a theory of island biogeography sort of approach in which space was mostly implicit, because we didn't really have any connectivity, to the kind of approaches that Tao was asking for before, right? So we wanted to use a meta-community model in which we actually had spatial structure, and the spatial structure was given by this network. So in this approach, you can think of your meta-community as a network of networks. So now we are going to have actual local patches, and in each of these local patches, which were connected in some fashion, you find a network that has some structure. And then there is dispersal between these patches. Changes depending with the distance in this case, in this toy model, with the coordinates of where the patches are placed. And in this model, again, it's very sort of simple because the structure of the network of patches, not of the network of interactions, but of the network of patches, it's assumed to be random. But obviously you can increase the level of complexity or the information that you give to the model if you know how is the network of your patches. If you're interested in conservation problems, it's very important to know how different protected areas are connected, and you can include this information in models like this. So again, if you're interested in these sort of problems, I give you the code here. So what I'm going to do is, again, going to explain exactly how this worked. So, yep.
This plot represents the final meta-community structure.
Yep.
In the equilibrium state, or continues to be dynamic. The individuals, these patches can move around this space.
Sorry, can you repeat that question?
This is the final state of the meta-community structure, or the patches can change?
Well, the meta-community structure in this particular model doesn't change with time. It's like a fixed network of patches. So the way in which local patches are connected is assumed not to vary in time. What varies is what is inside them. But the actual configuration of the patches in the landscape is the same. Does that make sense, or? Okay.
You can incorporate that?
Yeah, you can incorporate. As I said, I'm just showing some examples here for you guys to know how we use these tools in ecology. But yeah, depending on your question, what is the type of models you want to develop, all of these things you can, you can move and change and incorporate. So yeah, for example, if you were interested in habitat fragmentation, one thing that I would do if I were to tackle that problem with a model like this is simulate that you lose, and actually we are going to have a look at that in, I think not tomorrow, but the day after, with a small sort of toy problem that we did for Tasmanian devils, and how disease spreads in metapopulations. So what we did was we had a structure like this, and we removed links, right? Just to assume that you were able to isolate patches for conservation. If you think about habitat fragmentation, for example, you can think of ways of in which this network structure could be sort of damaged, and what would be the consequences of that for local network structure and also the regional food web. Yep. Cool, very interesting. Do you have any other questions? Yeah.
In the movement of the individuals from the pool to different patches.
Sorry, you asked me about this. Well, first of all, here, this is not an individual-based model, so here individuals don't move. What move are the species. So I just assume that a species has some sort of colonization probability or dispersal probability, sorry. And the whole species, not only like a few individuals, but like the whole node is replicated in the other patch. Since we are not dealing with actual population dynamics at the local scale, then I am just assuming that the species is able to survive there regardless. If you were to make this a dynamical model, then you will need to send individuals to the new patch. And if you have differential equations here for simulating population dynamics, then the species could go extinct, right? So
and this probability is connected to the number of interactions in the pool network structure, because I thought that species that had less interactions or more interactions could have a different probability to migrate to different patches.
No, not really. We assume that they, I mean, again, this is some detail that if you had a clear question in mind about why do you think that would be the case, but we didn't have like an a priori expectation of why dispersal should depend on degree of the node, which is what you are basically suggesting. So we just assumed that dispersal probability was the same across all species. So we went over each of the nodes in each local patch, and with certain probability that node could reappear in whatever patch they are connected to. So yeah, basically then we had a model like this in which at each time step we looked at each of the nodes in each of the patches, and depending on which patches they were connected to, they could move to another patch. So for example, if I chose this top predator to move through this dispersal corridor, then here I would have a new species. Obviously, you know, again, as in the previous model, if a species was chosen to move to a new patch in which it didn't have a prey, then it was not able to colonize, and we assume that colonization event failed, basically. So the network stayed the same as it was before because the invasion was not successful. So and then, yeah, sorry, did you have any other questions about this? It's all clear or nice. So we now have like a network of networks in which the layout or the network of patches is constant across the entire simulation. So that structure doesn't change, but the structure of the local communities does change because species are moving from one to another. And what we want, because as I said before, you know, the whole point of today's lecture or session was to try to understand better the interplay between two things: local interactions and spatial dynamics, right? So local interactions are here exclusively dependent on the food web structure, and the spatial dynamics are dependent on how likely it is that the species will move from one another, which in ecology we call dispersal. So since we wanted to understand that, basically what we varied was the dispersal capacity or the dispersal rate of species across these patches. And using different dispersal rates or dispersal scenarios, which in here I have 0 for no dispersal, just to see what would happen if communities were totally isolated, 0.01, 0.05, and 0.1. And then if you run this code, again, all of the network properties are here in case you want to look at, you know, what happens to other properties. But then we can look at the scaling of, you know, biodiversity depending on dispersal. And I guess the interesting, why don't you tell me what is like the first thing that you see in this plot? The first main difference between the different colors. That they scale up, and which one is at the bottom all the time? Yeah, exactly. So one sort of main thing, which we already knew, but you know, you also see here, is the fact that when you have dispersal, communities are always more diverse, right? And this goes back to the sourcing dynamics idea and all that stuff that we have been talking about during the lecture. So it's nice to see that in this sort of representation or model, you also get that. And then what is the other kind of broad pattern that you can see from here? What happens at the, oh yeah, are you going to say something?
I was thinking that maybe it's the stabilization with the of the island, maybe.
Yeah, that, I mean, again, that is sort of expected. Again, I guess one interesting thing about that is that regional biodiversity, which is what you're talking about, is different and higher for higher levels of dispersal. That is I guess, a second thing. But I was looking for something more like distinctive, especially in the first part of the plot. So if you look at this part, so at excesses between 0 and 10, let's say, what do you think about this?
The communities with the more dispersal get to the point of maximum species number faster.
Yeah, exactly. Basically, the other sort of classical result in meta-community theory, which is that high levels of dispersal homogenize your local population. So you are always going to find the entire regional community, if dispersal is high enough, only by looking at a single patch. So what this basically means is that if you have a meta-community in which dispersal is less likely, so you will have more heterogeneous communities at the local scale, and it also means that you will need to sample more of your communities to have a good idea of the regional pool of species and the regional, in this case, shape of the network, right? Because if you want to know, you know, for this level of dispersal, how many species you have, you know, it can vary from here to here, you know? Like, for example, this replicate of species 0, it's up to here, right? So if you want to know what is the shape of the network, you need to sample a lot of things. Whereas here, all of the purple lines are sort of clumped together, which means that, you know, they all have like the same biodiversity. What else I was gonna say? Oh yeah, one detail I forgot to mention about the specification of the model is that in order, I'm guessing that you already guessed this, but in order to get, I mean, to scale up here in area, what we did was to, you know, increase or clump together the different patches in the metapopulation sort of structure, right? So you grab one, and this would be 0.1 here. Then you choose to mix them together, and this is area 2, and so on. So it's like kind of aggregation procedure, which is what you are going to find in the code there, in case you're wondering. So I think, yeah, I think I'm a bit early probably, but this is what I wanted to say today, I guess. Oh yeah, sorry.
So I'm trying to relate this with the concepts of alpha, beta, and gamma diversity.
Yep.
So what you're basically showing us is that the higher the dispersal is, the closer alpha and gamma are, and the lower alpha and gamma diversity are.
Yeah.
Like they're equal.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
the lower beta diversity is that?
Yeah, exactly. That is exactly what it means. So I didn't know that you guys were familiar with all these different types of diversity, but in diversity, so for those of you who aren't, then you usually, when you are looking at different spatial scales, you can quantify diversity in 3 different ways. So alpha, which is local diversity, then gamma, which is the total diversity at the regional level, and then you can quantify alpha diversity, which is the difference or the gain that you get between 2 local alpha communities that you might or might have not quantified alpha diversity for. So when you have high levels of dispersal, all of those things approach gamma, and beta is almost 0. When dispersal is very low, these things are very far from gamma, and beta is very high, close to 1 or whatever is the number that you are using to quantify. So alpha diversity or number of species at a local scale, gamma at the regional scale, and beta, what is the contribution that you get when you sort of clump or aggregate, or basically the difference between 2 local communities. Yeah. Cool. Do you have any other questions, or if any of you read this paper and want to, have a discussion about it or want to ask me, well, not only about this paper, but in general, if you want to talk to me, I am always in 109, so just feel free to come by and we can chat about whatever you want. Cool. Thank you.